Yeah, so I'm really I do have a confession to make just to start. Wonder, the heart of the spiritual life. I came up with the title for this talk before I thought about the talk. So we had to kind of work in reverse order, but doesn't it sound like a great title? Wonder, the heart of the spiritual life. It's something soft, it's something, you can't quite grab onto, and that might be what this talk feels like for all of you. But we're going to start just thinking about what does it mean to engage as somebody who's really thinking about spirituality and contemplation, and how do we encounter Christ, how do we encounter the gospel in our daily lives? So we're going to look at wonder as a concept. Then I'm going to take it through the spiritual exercises themselves and then expand it again and see where we take it. So if you have questions, if things come up, if you have your own testimony that you'd like to give and you could take 15 minutes, that'll cover some time for me. That'll be great. But I think if we look at this together, there's something intuitive about this title, from the very start, that there is this impulse in all of us, this drive to seek something bigger than ourselves, to seek something in the mysteries of life and the mysteries of the universe. We'll characterize it in this talk within Catholic terms, within Christian terms, really looking at Scripture and Christian spirituality. But I want to just start off by saying this is a disposition that's available to everyone, and that everyone in their own way has this capacity for wonder from the time that we're young children all throughout our lives. And so I think the real challenge of the spiritual life is to hang on to this feeling of wonder, to hang on to this disposition that we get from our parents, from people who've gone before us, from the traditions that we engage with, to hang on to that feeling and to not let ourselves become so calcified to the rhythms of our lives to not actually see what's right in front of us. So I want to start with a story. So there's this great family video when I was growing up of myself and my twin sister, my two brothers, and we're in Michigan. And so for St. Louisans, going to Door County, Michigan, that's Wisconsin. Well, going to Michigan somewhere as a family was a really big deal. It was like our chance to leave the city, to take a break. And my parents had just gotten a camcorder. And so they're filming us in all this new environment of the sand dunes and going to the beach and arguing with one another and wrestling and sitting around a campfire and making s'mores. It's a really raw image of our family at this time. And my sister and I are these two 5-year-old kids. And my mom, in one of the scenes, is standing behind the camera, and she's walking, and I'm walking right in front of her. And she's pointing to things, and she goes, "Oh, look at that. What is that?" And I, in my 5-year-old way, I'm like, "Oh, it's a tree." And she's like, "Oh, what is that?" "Oh, it's flowers. It's a squirrel. It's this, it's that." Just going through one thing after the other, and she's saying, "What is that? What is that? What do you see there?" And we get to this animal on the ground, and she says, "Oh, and what is that? Is that a chipmunk?" And then very confidently, very, very much with certainty, I say something that sounds like chipmunk but isn't quite chipmunk and will be seared into our family forever, even without my knowledge in this moment. It's a word that sounds like Schmidt, very confidently. And I just say some version of, "Mom, it's a Schmidtbunk." And my family, of course, remembers that forever. And so every time we're together, every holiday, every event, we're reminded of this moment where I mispronounced chipmunk. But when I go back in my memory to that moment, when I think about that time, of course, there's this funny moment, this punchline that gets carried over into our family. But then I think about, what is my mother doing in that moment? She's in her mid-30s, walking with me, her young son, through this little wooded area, pointing to things and saying, "What is that? What is that? What are these things? What is right in front of you? Can you name that? Do you know what that is?" And me, in my childlike nature, I'm okay with not knowing. and I can ask her, I don't know tell me what that is. Or I can try to name something with confidence and get it wrong. But there's this disposition that she's trying to cultivate in me, even maybe without her knowledge, even without her really thinking about, I want a child that looks with wonder out at the world. No, I think she's just being a good mom in this moment. She's trying to cultivate in me a sense of wonder at the world, a sense of wonder at creation, at the things that are in front of us that point to deeper realities. And it begins in a very simple way with learning vocabulary, with learning about the world around us, with observing and being attentive to nature. I think a lot of us have this feeling, I think, in our lives. We go on a camping trip or even we just walk around a campus like this, or we're in the city of Fountain, so maybe you go into the plaza and you see these beautiful architecture, you see these beautiful things all around you, and you have a sense in you of wonder. You think about the things as they are, how nature emerges in the spring and flourishes in the summer and then begins to fade away in the fall and the winter. And we're a part of that. We're immersed in that. And from a young child, you begin to really feel a sense that while I do live separated from this natural reality, I'm also immersed in it and a part of it. And so I think that's where it begins. It begins in nature. Of course, there's cosmic wonder as well, looking up at the stars, seeing our smallness in the universe, being humbled by a night sky. There's another story about my parents waking us up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. on a school night. It's a Tuesday, and my mom comes into our room. These are kind of like hippie people. So my mom comes into our room, and she wakes me up. And she wakes my siblings up and she goes, "Oh, there's a meteor shower tonight. We got to go to this meteor shower. But we can't see it in Florissant, Missouri. We have to drive over the river to Illinois to a field to see the meteor shower clearly." Now, this is a school night. It's 3 a.m. But we pack all of us into the car. We drive over into Illinois, into this field. We get out of the car, and it's cloudy. After all of that, we get into the car, we wake up, we're tired, but we're going, we get to the field, and it's too cloudy to see, and we drove even further into Illinois trying to find a spot where maybe it'd be clear enough to see these meteorites, and it just never happened. We tell that story in my family thinking about maybe how my parents felt disappointed in that moment, or maybe how we maybe felt disappointed, like having to wake up in the middle of the night. But I actually look back on that story with a lot of fondness. That somehow, I think my parents cultivated in us enough imagination that I didn't actually have to see the night sky in that moment. That they had cultivated in us enough of a feeling of what it means to be in the universe, what it means to engage with the cosmos, that I could already see it in my mind from the moment that my mom woke us up and said, "We're going to see a meteor shower." That there's something about who we are as human beings that we don't necessarily have to see directly the results of nature, but that we can, in our imagination, even imagine some of the most beautiful scenes. So you may have never seen a night sky that looks something like this, or that's so open like that. That's a ribbon of our galaxy that you're seeing right there. That's an amazing sight. You may have never seen that, but you could imagine the immensity of the stars around us, the immensity of God's creation as we engage. I'm way off my script, but you can imagine what kind of parents those are who are trying to instill in their children this fascination with nature and with the reality around us. And I don't think I ever quite let that go in my life. I think that all of my life I've been kind of immersed in this natural theology, the sense that God is present in nature, that God is present in the created things of the universe, God, of course, can be found in a cathedral and St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it can be found in these great places where there are these sanctuaries. They're human design. But the reality is, I think that the greatest cathedral, the greatest sanctuary around us is the natural world, and that we are invited every day in our own way to engage it on its terms. So tomorrow it's going to be a big snowstorm here in Kansas City. We're all shaky about it. I'm thinking about my flight. I'm thinking about how we're going to get the Uber there, how we're going to get to work, how we're going to get the kids to school. And I heard maybe there's no school tomorrow, which is exciting for some people. But the reality is we're still at the mercy of nature. That should be a wake-up call to us. As much as we want to strive and succeed and have a life that's not, contained by the natural world around us, we're all still held by it and still reminded, even in moments of 4 to 10 inches of snowfall, that we are not in control. That there are greater powers at play, that there's a greater reality around us. I think if we look at Scripture, we know this to be true from the very beginning. Of course, there are these wonderful creation accounts where God speaks into the void and life and creation comes into being. That light comes from God's voice, and vegetation and animals and human beings. That God breathes into the lungs of Adam and brings life to him. These beautiful, beautiful stories, these intimate stories of God's connection to nature and to humanity. One of those stories, of course, is Moses. Moses, he's left Egypt, and now he's out in the field taking care of the sheep, and he gets lost, and then this burning bush emerges. And of course, the bush is not consumed by the fire, and Moses hears this voice as he approaches the bush that says to remove his sandals because he is on sacred ground. This connection between the divine and the natural in that moment. And it's not just, God created this and therefore I can see God's beautiful design. In this moment, in the burning bush, the bush itself is the presence of God, who is. The I am who am. It's the presence of God beneath creation that's present in all of creation. It starts to get a little psychedelic, in our understanding of what it means to encounter God in nature, that God is present in nature itself and pushing out into our reality to remind us of that connection. And so when we're engaged in nature, it is a burning bush moment. It is a moment where we can really engage with God, who is beneath all creatures, beneath all being. We see this a bit also in Mary's story, this annunciation by the angel Gabriel, who comes to Mary, who surprises her, who troubles her in this announcement that she's going to give birth to Jesus, that she's going to have a son. And she holds this awe, this wonder in her heart in that moment. She has this encounter that the God that you find in the world, the God who created the cosmos, who breathed life into Adam, who accompanied your people from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land, that God now visits you. And not only that God lives within you. That's the message of this moment that Gabriel is announcing, that the created beauty of the world, the divinity that we encounter in the cosmos, now lives in humanity. And it begins with Mary, a God who dwells among us and is brought to life in this beautiful way, the way that we've all entered the world. I have some friends who are new mothers. And I think about this quite a bit. I think about what would it be like, now I'm not a new mother, so I'm having to imagine, but what would it be like to wake up in the middle of the night and to find your child in its crib awake and to hold him in your arms in the dark without your phone, without any kind of connection, and to simply share that moment with your child. To simply share this loving connection with someone who lived in you, who was a part of you, who is still a part of you, and to love that being in a way that is inexplicable. You know, you can't really put words around that kind of moment. And that is an encounter with the divine. I think we want to write that off sometimes. I think we want to say that, well, that's just the natural order of things, or that's how people are, or there's these chemicals in the mother's brain that are firing that make her want to be more nurtured. Of course, that's true. But what's behind that? What's beneath that? Why is that? Why does it even exist to begin with? It's this beautiful, beautiful connection that we can have, not just with nature, but through the image of Mary and through our own understanding of who God is, we have it with one another. That deep shared experience of the divine present among us, with us in that moment. Of course, Jesus embodies that in a very special way. Jesus is God who dwells among us. He is our Emmanuel, God who is with us. And the disciples are always, throughout Scripture trying to figure this out. They're trying to wrap their mind around how is this possible and who is this? Is he just a prophet? Is he a good teacher? Is he someone who's moral and just worth following? Is he a rabble-rouser? Is he a zealot? Has he come to get an army together to take over our land, to reclaim our space? And they're trying to figure this out, and then there's this great moment in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is in the boat and he's sleeping, and this big storm comes up. And the disciples, they've got this image in their mind of who Jesus is and what he came to do and what he might bring to them, what benefit he might give them. And he's sleeping in this boat, and there's this big storm, and he's not doing anything. And they're freaking out. They don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. They're not safe. And so they go over to him. Now, are you just going to let us perish? Are you okay with this? Is this part of your plan? How did we even get in this place? And so Jesus wakes up, and he rebukes the wind, and he says to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. What do you do with that? What do you do as a disciple in this moment? You've seen certain things happen. You might have seen a healing. You've heard Jesus preach. You've seen the way that he can debate with scholars of the law and the Pharisees, and he wins those debates. He's very smart. He's talented. And yet here, even the wind and the sea obey him. What do you do with that? What does that mean? What does that mean for us in our faith? It's not so simple. He's identifying himself as more than a teacher, more than a prophet, something bigger than we've realized. That Jesus, in his way, is showing us that he has God's real, very real presence within him. That even the wind and sea obey him. And just as the disciples should not have been satisfied with their previous understanding of who Jesus was, imagine if they just stayed with the mindset that he's a prophet. Imagine if they just stayed with the mindset that he's a good teacher. They wouldn't have realized the full potential of his teaching. They wouldn't have realized the full potential of his life, death, and resurrection. That it's actually in this moment, this very strange, radical moment, this magical moment, this enchanted moment of speaking out to the sea and calming the wind and saying, "Peace, be still." This is where Jesus identifies himself as one with reality, one with, so much so that he's able to manipulate it and move it by his very being, by his voice. So that God that created the universe and spoke it into being, that created light and spoke it into being, now speaks to those same creations and commands them. And so when we think about our own lives, sometimes we feel pretty settled with our impression of God or our impression of who Jesus is. We feel pretty comfortable. We say, well, the catechism says this, and my pastor says this, and I've always been instructed that it's this. But I think what we are being asked to do with this sense of wonder is to shake it up. Be comfortable with not knowing, to be comfortable with the mystery of it. What we're asking is to not be settled with what we think we know, but to allow ourselves to embrace the reality in front of us, to not rely simply on our past knowledge, simply on the hierarchical structures that tell us it's this way or that way, as important as those things can be. I mean, I'm not some radical priest, I'm still in this, but the reality is that what the church is asking of us is to have a personal relationship with Christ. And sometimes our rigidity, sometimes the things that we think are comfortable for us get in the way of that personal relationship, that personal connection. And so I think wonder, what we're talking about, as silly as it might sound, as childish as it might sound, I think that it is actually the way, in the end, to be shaken out of what we think we know, to be shaken out of the secure knowledge that we hold, and to look at things in a different way, to allow God to break through our reality and to encounter Him as He is, as best we can. You know, we're not all going to become these mystics in the world, but we might. You might. There might be a moment where you've so opened yourself up to the possibility that God could find you and encounter you that it really does happen. And I don't think we should write that off. I don't think that moment in the dark with the child is nothing. You know, I don't think that moment where I'm a priest and I'm sitting and listening to someone in a confessional and they say that one truth that they could never say out loud to anyone else, and it's healing for them. I don't think that's nothing. I think that God encounters us when we're shaken up, when we're disturbed a little, when we have nothing else to grab onto. That's when God pushes forward into our reality. A quote: "Wonder is a state of mind in which we do not look at reality through the lattice work of our memorized knowledge, in which nothing is taken for granted." So nothing is taken for granted in wonder. There's nothing that we can quite grab onto. There's nothing that we can say, oh, this is definitively what God is, who God is, what this mystery is out there, as if the creed is the only statement of our faith. The creed is beautiful. It grounds us. It brings us together as a community. But our faith, the felt faith of our lives, is so much more than that. It's what we see. It's what we hear. It's what we feel. It's an embodied experience. That's what our faith is. It's not just something we have memorized. It's something we know deep down in our hearts, in our bodies. And I think Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's this great theologian, I think he hits it right on the head, right here, where it's, do not look at reality through the lattice work of our memorized knowledge. This is a beautiful painting. This is by, I'm forgetting his name. I'll find it out later. But this painting is Song of Songs. So this is my beloved, my beautiful one. He stands at the wall. He looks through the lattice and peers within. And this, in the mind of this artist, is Christ. And so it's Christ who's peering through the lattice, peering through those certainties that we have, and trying to encounter us directly, face to face. Thomas Merton puts it a little differently. He's talking about contemplation. And Merton, of course, is a mystic. You know, he is someone that we know to have a real sense of God's presence here and now, the immanence of God present in our reality. And he says that contemplation, this act of prayer and encountering God in the world, that contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is spiritual wonder, spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is a vivid realization of the fact that life and being in us proceed from an invisible, transcendent, and infinitely abundant source. Contemplation is above all awareness of the reality of that source. Or Willy Wonka put it this way: if you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it. It's here, it's now, it's present to us in this moment. That the source of all life, the source of our humanity, of our creation, God, here in hiding, is present to us in creation. And this contemplation, it doesn't have to be based off of our reading of the patristic authors from the 3rd century. It doesn't have to be based off of our understanding of Thomas Aquinas or medieval philosophers and theologians, as important as those things are, as beautiful as those writings are. But all of those writings, all of the work of the church is leading us to this, a sense of spiritual wonder at the world, a sense that God is present to us, active and alive in our lives. So however you get there is how you get there. There's no one way. The church is expansive. It's this huge tent that we're all living in, and there are many, many ways to Christ. There are many, many ways to encounter the divine within our reality. We are called to shake ourselves up a little bit. No matter how old we are, no matter what our experiences are, no matter where we come from or who we've encountered, I think each one of us is called to encounter God in a new way. You heard at the beginning when David introduced me all of those places and things, and Siberia and Russia and all that silliness really in the end. But the biggest takeaway from all of that is how God manifests himself in particular ways to people all around the world. That people who are living on the streets of San Francisco, who are doped up on some crazy toxin that's been delivered to them from some impossible network to put down, that person too has an opportunity to encounter God in their lives. And it would be a mistake as a minister to ever write that off. That the person who's living in Russia, who survived the siege during World War II, who had to eat boiled cow bones in her apartment, who survived off of that for months and months at a time, who can turn to me and say, and yet I knew I was not alone in that apartment. That woman knew who God was. That woman knew God's presence with her in her suffering, in the difficulties of her life. You find it all over the world, among all people, this real sense of God's presence to them. Most recently, before coming to New York, working on the U.S.-Mexico border and working with migrants who had come through Venezuela, up through Central America, all through Mexico, and then to the border, only to be told that you're going to have to wait another 6 months before you can enter the United States. And they're there with their children, they're there with their sick relatives, they're there with their friends who've suffered along the way. They're carrying these horrible, horrible experiences, and yet you sit down and you talk with them and you say, how are you doing? And they say, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. God is with me. God has been with me. God has cared for me. And not just that, let me tell you how he's done it. All along the way, he's cleared every obstacle. All along the way, he's loved me. Even that time when we were kidnapped, he was there and he was helping me. That sense of God's presence is what people cultivate within themselves, whether they've read Thomas Aquinas or not. Whether they've encountered these great texts of our tradition or not, they have a real sense of who God is for them and that God is with them through their lives. And so you might be sitting here thinking, well, I love Thomas Aquinas. Of course you do, and that's great. It's great, and you can find God in that. But for all of us, there's an avenue to this sense of wonder, to this sense of God's presence in our lives. And I think it begins with this cultivation of awe, this cultivation of a sense that behind our reality, just beneath the surface of our conception, there is a greater reality, a divine reality at play. Okay, so the spiritual exercises, St. Ignatius' spiritual exercises. I had to cram this in here. No, it's the center point of our lives as Jesuits. It is this instruction manual for us for how to cultivate wonder and amazement at our lives at creation, at the life of Christ, and then eventually to be sent out into the world preaching this message of God's abiding love for all people, that God is present in all things. And so when we look at the spiritual exercises, we're really asked to begin with a perception of ourselves and who we are, which is interesting that Ignatius asks us to look inward at ourselves. Who are we? What are we called to be? What is our place in the world? And so Ignatius has us look first at our sins. Something we don't always like to look at, something we don't always like to touch. Sometimes we want to refrain from topics of our own sinfulness, our own difficulties, our shallowness, our guilt, the gossip that we perpetuate, the lies that we tell. All of those things, you and I, we're engaged in that. I mean, that is a part, the fabric of our lives are some of these difficult things that are a part of us, these habits that we fall into. And yet, Ignatius asks us to be honest about those, to really dig into them, to see how we have given into the voice of the evil spirit. And yet, when holding those up to God, what do we receive? His mercy and His love. I am a sinner yet loved by God. Wow. He has all these great meditations about, I mean, it starts to get a little scary. It's like, why has hell not swallowed me whole? Why have I not been cast into damnation with the fires and the cursing and the wailing out to God? Why has that not happened to me? And Ignatius knew sin. He knew difficulty. He knew that he had brought about harm to other people in the world. And so he's asking himself those big questions. And then he intuits that nothing is untouchable by God's love and mercy. That nothing we do, no sin we bring into the world, no difficulty, no habit that we have, nothing that detracts from our relationship is irredeemable. That God's love, God's mercy can be present in all of it. We have simply to call upon that grace. We have to acknowledge our own difficulties, our own sinfulness, and hold it up to the light of God's grace and mercy. That's an amazing place to start on a retreat. It's an amazing place to start in our spiritual lives. It's something we're afraid of. It's something we'd rather not bring up, rather not think about. And yet, ultimately, where are we going? God's love and grace in our lives. God's love and mercy present in our hearts. To be a wounded person and yet healed by God's love enables us to go out into the world and foolishly preach His gospel. I think to feel yourself loved and redeemed, not perfectly, my sins are not gone, not in a sense that I'm, somehow better or above anyone, but that precisely in my humility, in my littleness, in my sinfulness, in the darkness of my heart, God reaches even there. And that from there, from that wound, I can be sent out into the world. That is the beginning of the spiritual life, that I can have hope in my life, that I'm not arrested by my sin, by my difficulties, and I can now engage in a greater reality. And so we wonder at the way that God loves us. We wonder at the way that God's mercy becomes a part of our lives, and then we were sent into, in the exercises, sent into the life of Christ. Now, having felt that sense that nothing in my heart is untouchable by God, I can be sent into these meditations of the Gospels. I can think about Jesus healing the blind man and feel His hands over my eyes, calling me to look at my life in a new way. I can think about Jesus who stoops down with the woman who was caught in adultery and says, "Has no one condemned you? Then neither do I condemn you." I can think about how the disciples would have felt in that room with Jesus when He broke bread with them and washed their feet. I can think about that feeling that Mary might have felt in that moment of the Annunciation, the fear and uncertainty, and yet somehow still finding the courage to say yes. I can think about all of that as a part of my life as well. Because when I have this sense that God is so much a part of my heart that even my sin is a part of His redeeming plan, then I can step forward thinking that Christ's message to me is the same one that he gave to the people that we encounter in the Gospels. That I am that blind man, that I am that woman caught in adultery, that I am the crippled man told, rise, pick up your mat and walk. That I am these same people who are simple fishermen, illiterate men, called by name, come and follow me. That I too am that person. That somehow, some way, Christ is making something happen in me in the same way that he made it happen in the people that we encounter in the Gospels. And so then we're invited in a very, very real way into the suffering of the cross, into the passion of Christ. This doesn't seem like a very wonderful place. It seems kind of cheap to call that wonder, to put that label on it. Because Ignatius does have you really think in detail about the crucifixion, to think in detail about Christ's passion, being rejected and denied by his followers, being turned over to soldiers and imprisoned and beaten, to go with Christ all through that passion. And yet, somehow, I think in my own ministry and the people that I've worked with, this has become the most important week for me. These have become the most important reflections in my life, to really encounter people who are suffering in incredible ways. Right now I'm working in New York City with people who are living on the streets, homeless people. I work in Times Square, and Times Square brings a lot of characters. There's a lot of people, it's not just Elmo and Minnie Mouse, it's everybody. I mean, everybody you could imagine coming into Times Square and bringing all of their experience of disappointment, of pain, their experience of suffering from their lives, the traumas of their childhood, and eventually these things get into a big, messy soup in their lives, and then they find themselves out on the streets. And sometimes they don't even know how long they've been on the streets. I could talk to someone and, well, how long have you lived in the subway here? And, well, I think maybe a few months. And then only come to find out that they've been there for 3 years, living in that state, in the filth of the subway and the difficulties of that environment. One woman who I met just a few months ago, she's been living in the subway for 3 years. She's in her mid-60s. She was raised in a really very difficult household, abandoned by her parents, and I had the opportunity to really work with her one-on-one to try to get her into housing. And so we met with her and a psychiatrist. We're trying to go through all these systems together, and I'm introducing her to the wider community that we're a part of. So I brought her now from the subway into a bigger community for adults with mental illness. And we're going through the house, and there's a group within the house that has produce that they make. So they have tomatoes and a little bit of lettuce. And the woman I'm working with, she's got severe cataracts, so she's got to hold things right up to her face in order to see it really well. And she takes a head of lettuce, she pulls it right up to her face, puts her eyeball right into it, and as she's looking at it, she starts to cry. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. If this is too much for you, we can go to another space, we can go to another room, and we don't have to continue the tour. And she just goes, it's just so beautiful. She was seeing something, of course, in this head of lettuce, but she was seeing something about herself in that moment, I think. I think she was encountering some sense of dignity that had been stripped away from her, some sense that she was a part of something bigger than herself, and here was this, weird guy that she can't even see well, inviting her into this space, who's trying to get her to find the help that she needs, who's contacting her sister, who's trying to get her to an apartment, trying to build real connections for her. And the most overwhelming part of it was an encounter with the natural world. She had been living in the subway for 3 years. She had not seen natural produce in 3 years. She had not seen a tree. It's amazing what people can endure in environments like that. And yet, when they encounter it again, when they encounter it anew, they're given some of that dignity back. It's been a hard transition for her. We've gotten into housing. It's been a few months. She's been hospitalized a few times. It's a difficult adjustment. But one of the beautiful things, I think, is being able to accompany someone through that, of not giving up on them in their self, not saying it's too hard for me, not saying this is so difficult that I just want to escape and go away. I've known that feeling. My experience of the third week of the exercises tells me that I want to run from pain, that I want to run away from the crucifixion, that all these people that we encounter who are crucified in our neighborhoods, in our families, these people that are in seemingly impossible situations, I want to run away from that. And yet I'm called to be like John. I'm called to be like Mary, standing at the foot of the cross and observing the horrors of what humanity can do to itself. I'm called to immerse myself in that reality, to be a part of that suffering in a way sometimes that others cannot. And so I think the third week of the exercises especially is something that as a society we could do well to cultivate within our hearts. The wonder of a God who is willing to lower himself to the point of that suffering, that horrible suffering on the cross. That is what it means, I think, to take on this Catholic mindset of God's presence in the world, that God is found in everything, including those moments we would rather not touch, including those moments of disgust and pain, that God is there too, and accompanies people who find themselves in those situations. And then, in the quiet of the night, in the silence of the tomb, something new happens. A new life emerges. That this seemingly impossible situation is somehow redeemed. And I think as people who are thinking about the spiritual exercises, this is the hope we always have to hold in our hearts. We can go with people into the abyss. We can go with people into the crucifixion, into the difficulties of their lives. But what we know is the resurrected Christ. What we know is the possibility for hope and redemption in the world, that it is not hopeless. As much as we want to give in to the headlines that we see and the scrolling that we do on Twitter and all those things that I know are just wrong for me, that I shouldn't be reading, that I shouldn't be engaging, that opinion article that I should have just put down, and I'm addicted to it. I have to engage it. I have to know more about it. I need to solve this problem of our government. I need to solve this problem of the systems. And I need to do all these things. At the end of the day, we cannot give up hope. We cannot give up the hope in our hearts that this too can be redeemed. That no matter what this is not a political talk, no matter what our political affiliation, no matter what our disposition is, that anything can be saved by God's grace. And that we're called as a people to preach that message as best we can, to not give in to the doom and gloom of our society, into this idea that we're more divided than we've ever been before. That doesn't have to be true. That doesn't have to be how we live. And I think the resurrection points to that. This divided moment where the disciples run away, where they deny Christ, where they go far away, the people walking to Emmaus, getting out of town, trying to get away, and yet Christ goes and finds them and tells them to go back to my brothers and to announce the good news, to tell them that I am risen. I mean, that is the message of the gospel, that what is divided, what is separated, will be brought back together in the risen Christ, that we are all one people, one body, sent out together on one mission. And so I think we have to be thinking about that in our lives. How do I live this sense of resurrection in my life? The wonder of God who labors in reality, who labors in nature and among his people, who then calls me to go forth and preach his holy gospel. The fourth week culminates in the contemplatio. So it's not just this sense of resurrection, but it is also this sense of real surrender from us, real surrender from our hearts. And so you have Ignatius. I think this proves my thesis, I gotta say. I think we're there. Here's Ignatius and how he talks about looking out at the world. Look how God dwells in creatures, in the elements, giving them being, in the plants, vegetating, in the animals, feeling, in men, giving them to understand, and so in me, giving me being, animating me, giving me sensation, making me to understand, likewise making a temple of me, being created to the likeness and image of His divine majesty. That's a nice thing to say. That's a nice thing to read about. It's another thing to really feel that in your heart. That's a nice thing for us to be thinking about as something that I aspire to. That the God who is present in creation, who is sustaining all things, bringing life to all things, who spoke into the void and created all of this, now dwells in the sanctuary of my heart, sustains me, breathes life into me, calls me into being, and sends me forth out into the world. That same God is present in every moment of every day. I simply have to look. I simply have to see. I have to be attentive to His presence in my life. That I think is the call that Ignatius is drawing us towards, and the reality that he wants for Jesuits and for anyone engaged in the spiritual life that he's proposing. That God is present in all things, through all things, and present in my own heart, calling me to engage with Him in the world and draw attention to Him when I preach His message to other people. So the entire retreat is leading to this posture of openness and trust and humility in who God is and what He is bringing about in the world. It is God's project that we are engaged in. Every school in our province, every Jesuit institution around the world, we are engaged in a divine project. It's not just about growing the endowment, as important as that is. It's not just about raising funds or seeking support, but it is about sending out, really being an organism of this message of Christ in the world, being a hub of that knowledge that we bear as sons and daughters of God, that knowledge that God is present in all things and through all things. And here's the Suscipe. This is the beautiful prayer at the end of the retreat. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will. All that I have and possess, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. All is yours. Dispose of it wholly according to your will. Give me your love and your grace, for this is sufficient for me. Wonder is something we can't help but surrender ourselves to, I think, once we find it. The wonder of God's presence in creation, in our family, in our own hearts, is something we can't help but want to seek again and again once we've even just had a taste of it. And I think that's what Ignatius is calling us to, that once we have that sense that God dwells in me, not just in my mind, but in my entire being, how could I not also turn myself over to that God as a gift for His divine pleasure, as Ignatius might put it, for His will, to be used by Him in the world to bring others to this sense of His presence. Oh, but it's so hard. It's so hard. It is not easy to. I mean, I don't know where you've been living or but it is not easy. Like thing after thing after. We live in a society that tells us we must produce, we must succeed, we must be efficient, we must go from thing to thing to thing. And just when you think you've had a break, you need to go to the gym and you need to make your to-do list and you've got to care for your kids and you've got to go to the soccer game and you've all of these things. It's overwhelming. It's too much. I mean, I really think that we as a society are just driving ourselves nuts. And we don't know what to do with all this pressure. We don't know what to do with this message that we must succeed, we must produce, we must have a goal, and we must achieve those goals, or else what? I mean, where is all of this leading? What is all of this for? I love this. I love this from Isaiah. I am ready to be sought by those who do not ask for me. I am ready to be found by those who do not seek me. I say, here I am, to a nation that does not call on my name. I spread out my hands all the day to a rebellious people who walk not in a way that is good, but follow their own devices. God is right there. He's saying, here I am. Pay attention to me. Be attentive to my presence. And yet we're filling our day with all of these, and these are important things, but how important are they when we're thinking about God's presence in our lives? How important are they when we're thinking about how we want to raise our children, what we want to cultivate in them, what sense of God's presence we want to give to them? Is it simply about producing? Is it about producing the best Catholic who can tell us, the 7 sacraments and their symbols and their colors, and all of those things are so important, and yet they're trying to communicate a deeper reality. It's not just about production. It's about a sense of God's presence within our hearts, present in every moment of every day, literally knocking at our door, saying, here I am, here I am. And so the church gives us so many ways to engage in this, to be thinking about this. We have prayers of the church. The liturgy of the hours might be one that people turn to. It cultivates in us a sense that we are not operating on our own schedule, that we are given hours throughout the day to engage with God, and it is God's time set aside for us. And so you have morning prayer, you have evening prayer, you have night prayer. These simple ways to not just use our own words, but to engage with a bigger tradition that has spoken to people throughout time. The rosary also is a great way for us to be praying, for us to be cultivating that sense of wonder. The repetition of the rosary, guiding us into deeper contemplation, looking at the mysteries of Christ's life, of the way that he was present, especially through the Virgin Mary, and asking us to see that grace in our own lives. These are just 2 sources of real cultivation for that wondering spirit that we're trying to bring about. That it could calm us, it could bring this silence into our hearts. It could be spiritual reading is a way for us to encounter God in the world. That if we read the lives of the saints, perhaps we start to see the sanctity of our own life. If we encounter the writings of these people who have really gone through their own suffering, their own difficulties, and yet can still be preaching this message of redemption and resurrection, that maybe we will find hope for ourselves in them. Or it could be as simple as the symbols of the church, of walking into a church and putting holy water on your head and thinking about your family who brought you through baptism into the sacraments of the church, and the people who went before them and before them and before them, generation after generation, also that you could do this yourself. That something we've inherited is speaking to us of a greater reality. Candles, prayer, adoration, service to one another. I think that is such a key for our own understanding of what it means to find God in the world. It's not just nature, it's not just the cosmos, it's not just the prayers that we offer through the liturgy of the hours or going to Mass or the Rosary. It is also Christ who said, when you do this for the least of my brothers, you do it for me. That's what it means to serve God in the world, that every person is an opportunity to encounter Christ alive and present in their hearts, that nobody can be simply written off as a bad person or a criminal or someone deserving of being sent out from the community, that everyone in the eyes of Christ is a brother and sister, and everybody is an opportunity to encounter God in the world. Okay, one last thing, and then we can do questions or complaints. I tried to do this. This is Loose Park. I tried to go out into the park and take some pictures because my goal was to say, well, Kansas City in the middle of February, there are all these places you can go to find a sense of wonder. There are all these things you can do. And so I decided to walk around the park, to have this goalless visit. I'm not exercising. I'm not like looking for something in particular. I'm just walking off the path and trying to engage with the reality in front of me. So first thing I see is this ice in the lake, and I'm just sitting there staring at the ice. I'm like trying to get something out of it, trying to find some meaning in it, and the whole time I'm thinking like, this is not the right way. I'm trying to tell you to find wonder in the world, and I'm like creating a list of like, here's how you would find it, and this is what you would do. But I started there, and then I went to the ducks, and then I don't know if you see these, but these are beautiful fish, and they were under the ice. So then I was trying to come up with a contemplation about like, they're living in another reality, and we're living above it, just like trying to really think through it. And then I came across this tree, which looks a little bit like a crucifix. And I was really trying to drum up some wonder for myself in order to get a point across to all of you. And then as I'm standing there, and I'm quiet, I didn't have my headphones in or anything, I'm standing there, and I hear the bells of a church at 10:30, and they're miles away, but I could just hear it in the background. And it's, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Amazing. That was what I needed. That was the reminder that I needed, that as much as you might want to drum up some sense of wonder or find meaning and God in the world, as much as you might want to drum up a sense of God's presence in the reality beneath the reality, the cosmic reality, all those things, that God is still in charge, and that God is full of surprises. That's the point of all of this, is that we might become so comfortable in our conception of what is possible, of where to encounter the divine, of how to do it, comfortable in our knowledge about our faith, comfortable in who we think we are and who we think God is, that we might be blind to the reality that God is moving in all of it. And God is present to us in ways that are often very, very surprising. And so sometimes it is the fish in the pond, and sometimes it is the tree that looks like a crucifix, but most often it's a bell in the distance calling you to remember that you're not alone, that God is present to you, and that there is hope and life in the world. Thank you. Do we do questions? Any questions?
I have one for you, Bob. So if the thesis for you is wonder, I think the antithesis for me is worry.
Oh, yeah.
How it just consumes us sometimes. And so how do you balance those two? Like not being worried about next week or your job or your family or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, it's hard for a Jesuit sometimes to answer that question.
You might repeat the question.
Oh, sure, yeah. If the thesis is wonder, then the antithesis could be worry. That worry creeps into that ability to wonder, right? That it kind of occupies that space. And we have to support our families. We've got to support the people that we care about, the mission that we've been given. I think that's a real thing. I think that if you did cultivate some spaces for yourself of wonder, like you do have to carve out some time. It's not something that necessarily just comes to us without our effort. So I think cultivating some space for prayer, some space for engagement with God does help to ease some of those worries, but doesn't always take them away. But I think that truly prayerful people that I've encountered that are engaged with some of the most difficult realities I've seen also have a sense of lightness that they move through the world with. That there is an ease with which they engage the world, and sometimes it demands their attention to really engage in difficult work and to think with people through serious problems. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to offer everything into God's hands. I could sit here and be worried about my people that I'm working with on the streets, and I could occupy myself all day with that reality, but I'm not sure that's the healthiest thing for me, and so can I let some distance between myself and that and create some other space to encounter God?